I'm Mike.
I'm Jason.
Welcome to Snake Envy. So we did a video earlier about kind of the difference between aggression and defensive behavior in snakes. But one of the things we want to follow up on that with is that the language we use, even amongst ourselves, people pick up on that. We're all guilty of it.
Yeah. I am.
We use words interchangeably because we know what we mean, and we know that the words aren't a big deal, but they are. If we have friends, family, neighbors, they pick up on the fact that we might use aggression instead of defensive. Even silly things, danger noodle. If you're somebody who's terrified of snakes, I don't even think you hear the noodle. All you hear is danger. You don't even know what the noodle means. But how important do you think it is that we're consistent in our language and that we portray snakes in a more positive light?
Well, I think it's very important, especially when you're in public too, or doing something in public, and newbies can pick up on that, and he's calling that aggressive, or
yeah,
and
social media,
yeah, but you just want to be like more accurate. And I don't think snakes are typically aggressive. I think that they will defend their ground. They'll be defensive in the fact that they don't want to be messed with, and they'll hold their ground.
And not all snakes even stand their ground. Some snakes, they only want to get away.
Yeah.
But the ones who do stand their ground, those are the ones that people remember.
Yeah.
Cottonmouths,
rattlesnakes,
gopher snakes, rattlesnakes.
Probably any bulls, gophers. Yeah.
They stand their ground. They put on a big show.
I've seen rat snakes put on some good shows.
Yep, exactly. And so those are the things that stick. If we reinforce that by referring to our snakes in ways that sounds aggressive or dangerous, it may all seem in fun to us, but to a family member, neighbor, friend, or somebody who's just seeing an interaction on social media, it matters. We encountered some kids when we were herping the other day, and I think the way we interacted with them matters. It's important. We asked them if they had seen these snakes up close before. Do you want to see one? Now it turns out they had caught some before. They weren't afraid of them.
Yeah.
But we didn't, hey, stand back, there's snakes over here.
Yeah, and we didn't, hey, these are dangerous or any, we didn't do any of that, and we offered more of an educational, behavior type stuff, what they're doing, this time of year.
I think on social media we don't always realize that there's a lot of people who join these snake groups who don't yet have snakes. And they're kind of feeling the hobby out and they're learning. And if they are constantly exposed to things like danger noodle, and I saw a social media interaction the other day, which is part of the reason you and I were talking about this topic. And the main emphasis of the person's post was, why are king snakes so aggressive? Is my king snake even more aggressive than most? And will my snake ever not be aggressive? And the thing I noticed in the conversation was even very experienced people, including some names that a lot of you might recognize who jumped into the conversation, they continued to use that word aggressive. Now again, I know they know the difference between aggressive and defensive, and they were probably just following along with the poster. But it matters. It matters when people don't come in and say, well, actually, no snake is aggressive. Your snake is just defensive. And here's how you can alleviate some of that. And if you go back to our prior video, we show some ways to deal with snakes in terms of taming them and handling them. How would you have answered that question?
I don't think it's aggression, because aggression to me is something coming after you.
Attacking.
Yeah, and a king snake, you're holding it, it starts biting you or whatever. I don't think that's aggression. I think that's more of an instinct where it's wanting to eat.
Yeah, king snakes in particular, you've also got to talk about the difference between a food response bite and even a defensive bite. And a couple people did chime in and said, hey, there are no aggressive snakes. Your snake's just being defensive. Now, what I found interesting about the conversation was that, and people talked about the difference between food response and defense. Guess what he was ultimately concerned about?
What?
Tail rattling.
Oh.
So the truth is, he wasn't getting bitten. He wasn't even getting musked. He was afraid to interact with the snake because of the tail rattles. Now, perfectly valid question from a beginner. You know, what is this tail rattle all
It's a
about?
warning.
Do I need to be concerned? But speaking of king snakes, let's talk briefly about the difference between food response and defensive bites. You took a food response bite here a few weeks ago from a young rat snake when we were filming. Defensive strikes are quick. And usually the body language tells you it's coming because they coil, S shape, they spring load and they come at you quick. How is that food bite different?
If I ever get, well, I've been bitten plenty. If it's a food response bite, they bite, and as soon as they bite, they know that's not food, and they let go. And so that's a food response.
Or they get the end of the finger and they do try to eat.
Well, yeah.
And that means your finger wasn't clean.
I mean, if you have mice, smell mice in your hands, it's not going to
Or other snakes.
A defensive bite is where it's gonna gnaw on you, and it's gonna want to send a message, leave me alone.
Yeah.
And it's not, hey, I think I can eat you, a giant human being, I think I can eat you. It's a more of a warning. It's to warn and tell you,
and hope
leave me alone.
Yeah, hope that you'll heed that warning and leave it alone and not handle it. That's the whole goal. They don't want you to handle it.
It's a defensive behavior.
What I've noticed with food response bites, and for king snakes, by the way, and milk snakes, I always recommend, handle those snakes first. If you have multiple snakes you're going to handle. But I always wash my hands with king snakes, and I also hand sanitize. Now, those are on the young ones, and those are the ones that are still being socialized. Usually by the time they're adults, they've outgrown all this behavior. They can tell the difference between me and food. But what I notice about food response bites is it's very slow. They will kind of investigate, and they'll sniff, and everything slows down. And if you see the snake investigating you that closely, there's a food bite coming.
Yeah.
So you want to redirect the snake's attention.
And that is a king snake thing.
Yes.
Where they're going to smell on you, and they're going to sit there, and then they're going to...
Yeah.
They're like, you can tell that they're...
And they very slowly and deliberately open their mouth. They treat your finger just like a mouse.
But yeah.
Defensive is quick.
But I've had quick ones. I've had quick feeding responses.
Yeah.
Where they shoot out of the cage and they bite.
Yeah.
And as soon as they hit me, my hand or whatever it is, they're like, oh, crap, this is not food. And then they let go, and then they even take off.
Yeah.
They don't hang around. They go to the back of the cage, and they're like...
That's an important distinction. When you open the enclosure, sometimes you'll get that immediate food response. It's almost, I'm going to strike first, and I'll ask questions later about what I get. I was telling you I have a green tree python. When he was young, his meals always needed to be warm, or he wasn't even interested in them. But my hand was, as he got into thawed prey, my hand is always more appealing than the room temperature prey. When you open his enclosure, it's a given that he's going to lunge. And so I've learned over time to open to the side, let him lunge, let him go back. What's interesting is as soon as he gets back, everything's good. Now I can come in with the prey, and he's not frenzied anymore. He takes the prey calmly. but he's got to get that initial one out of the way. So yes, that's a good point. Some food response bites are quick from the enclosure. Typically, once you're handling a snake, that's more what I was referring to. The defensive is usually going to be quick, and the food, it's almost like they're checking you out. I've even seen king snakes where they seem interested in my arm hair.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, this feels right. What does that smell like? Then you get a couple tongue flicks. Well, they're letting you know, hey, this looks good. So move it away, redirect it.
And every species is a little different. Like bull snakes and gopher snakes, I've only seen it one time where it's holding a bull snake and it was doing that thing where it starts.
Yeah.
But almost every time with Pitiophis it's almost a strike.
Yeah.
Instead of a slow bite.
Yeah, it's definitely a king snake behavior. Very slow, very deliberate. They're checking you out.
Rat snakes might do it a little bit.
Yeah. But getting back to the broader point, if any time we have these interactions, we go to social media or we tell our friends or we tell our neighbors, man, I got one snake that is always aggressive and always a challenge and always, well, that person may already be leery of snakes. So that behavior that we reinforce, that negative connotation of snakes, they're going to take that with them out into the wild.
Yeah.
And too many wild snakes get killed as it is. And if we are mistakenly, furthering that reputation of snakes as being mean or aggressive, those folks are going to take that into the wild with them. And
yeah, one thing else I wanted to mention is I have a bull snake that just loves to hiss and strike, and that snake does it every time. If I was to sit out here, it would sit there and be defensive. And I haven't worked with it enough to break it, but I was cleaning cages the other day and it was out. And it's a 2022 hatchling, so it's little bull snake. But it would always sit here and do this defensive posture. But when I was cleaning his cage, it recognized me. Do you think it did that? No, it fleed as soon as it could. It was out of there. It burrowed under the aspen. And so it's definitely not aggression.
No, not at all. So just to reiterate, we highly recommend that we be a little more careful in the language that we use and the language that we choose. And if we're talking to whether it be beginners or whether it be people who have no interest in the hobby at all, the language matters.
Sure.
There's a lot of people out there who live by the mantra that the only good snake is a dead snake. And if we are helping to perpetuate whatever fears they have, that doesn't work out well for snakes in the wild or for the growth of the hobby. That young man on Facebook who was worried about the tail rattling, it's interesting that the first 6 or 7 comments in that thread sort of reinforce the idea that, you may have an aggressive snake, and that doesn't serve the hobby well. So it's important that we be a little more mindful of the language we use. Thank you.
Thanks.